It was a quiet night at the police station in a small rural district. FBI agents were in the area investigating a disappearance case that had puzzled local authorities. Suddenly, a thin dog with dirty fur and eyes full of despair appeared at the station's entrance. It didn't bark or growl, only whimpered, as if begging for help. At first, no one paid much attention to the animal. It was common to see stray dogs wandering around the area. But there was something different about this one. It insisted on drawing attention, pulling the agents toward the door. The dog's behavior was so unusual that one of the investigators, Agent Parker, decided to follow it. "This dog seems to know something," he said jokingly. But deep down, something told him it was worth checking out. Agents Parker and Lewis had no idea what they were getting themselves into. It all started with that mysterious dog, which kept looking at them with an urgency that seemed almost human. Parker, intrigued by the animal's unusual behavior, decided they couldn't ignore it. "What if it knows something?" Parker said, half laughing, as he grabbed his flashlight. "Or it's leading us into a trap," Lewis replied, not hiding her skepticism. The dog dashed down the road, and the two agents decided to follow it. At first, they walked quickly, but soon they found themselves running to keep up. The dog seemed to know exactly where it was going, as if it had a clear purpose. Every few meters, it would stop, turn its head, and look directly at them, as if to say, "You need to come now." The road they followed was flanked by tall trees, forming a natural tunnel. The moonlight barely managed to pierce through the canopy, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything as they moved forward. The sound of their own footsteps was muffled by the damp earth, while the wind whistled uneasily through the branches. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Lewis commented, breaking the silence. Parker glanced at her but didn't respond. He felt something strange in the air too, a kind of electricity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Still, he couldn't ignore the dog, which seemed determined to lead them somewhere. As they continued, the dog began to behave even more strangely. It growled softly now and then, as if warning them about something ahead. At one point, it stopped suddenly and began sniffing the ground, circling a specific spot. "What is it now?" Lewis asked, trying to control her impatience. Parker crouched down and pointed his flashlight at the spot where the dog was sniffing. It was a torn piece of fabric caught in a bush. It wasn't just any fabric. It looked like a piece of dirty, tattered clothing with stains that resembled dried blood. "This is starting to get serious," Parker said, standing up quickly. The dirt road began to narrow into a winding trail, surrounded by dense bushes and roots sticking out of the ground like natural traps. Every step felt heavier, and the darkness seemed even thicker. The dog, however, didn't hesitate. It kept moving forward, driven by an energy that seemed endless. "You realize we're in the middle of nowhere, right?" Lewis said, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, but look at him," Parker replied, pointing to the dog. "He knows exactly where he's going." As they walked, they noticed that the forest around them was eerily silent. There were no sounds of birds or insects, only the muffled noise of their footsteps and heavy breathing. "It's too quiet," commented Lewis, gripping the flashlight more firmly. "I know," Parker replied in a low voice. The dog stopped again, this time at the entrance to a clearing. It looked at the agents and started barking, not angrily, but as if urging them to come inside. The clearing seemed isolated, untouched by time. "I think this is it," Parker said, swallowing hard. Lewis took a step back, hesitant, but Parker was already convinced. The dog, once again, didn't seem to be wrong. Before entering the clearing, the dog started behaving even more strangely. It stared intensely at the two agents, growled softly, and then let out a long, low whine. "What is it now?" Lewis asked, trying not to sound scared. Parker felt a chill. It was as if the dog was trying to say something, not to guide them, but to warn them. Something in the air seemed to shift. The clearing ahead didn't just seem empty. It seemed wrong. Still, they knew they couldn't turn back now. With flashlights in hand and nerves on edge, the agents decided to follow the dog into the clearing. What they found there would change their lives forever. When Agents Parker and Lewis crossed the clearing's threshold, they immediately felt a change in the atmosphere. The air seemed heavier, almost suffocating, and the silence was so absolute that even the sound of their breathing felt too loud. The dog, which had been leading the way, abruptly stopped in front of an old cabin. It was partially covered by plants and looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. Yet, something about the scene felt off. "This doesn't just look like an old cabin," Parker said, trying to analyze the structure with his flashlight. "No. It looks more like a forgotten mausoleum," murmured Lewis, pulling her coat tighter as though the place had suddenly gotten colder. The dog let out a short, sharp bark, as if to say, "Go inside now." As they pushed the door open, a long creak echoed, cutting through the night silence. The smell hit them first, a nauseating odor, a mix of mold, damp earth, and something that smelled like decaying flesh. "My God. What is that?" Lewis said, covering her nose and stepping back. "Stay calm," Parker replied, gripping his flashlight tightly and pointing it inside. The beam of light revealed a small room cluttered with objects scattered in an oddly deliberate manner. There were melted candles, yellowed photographs pinned to the walls with rusty nails, and strange marks on the floor, as if someone had drawn symbols with charcoal. "This looks like an altar," Parker said, cautiously examining the objects. The walls were covered with dozens of photographs, most faded and in black and white. They were portraits of people, many smiling, but some looked frightened, as if the pictures had been taken against their will. Lewis carefully picked up one of the photos, observing the name and date written on the back. Anna Peterson, June 5, 1987. "These dates," she started, but her voice faltered as she realized something terrible. "Parker, these are missing persons." Parker turned quickly and began examining the other photos. The dates on the back matched the missing persons cases filed in their investigation. Each photo represented a victim, and the most recent ones were less than 2 months old. "This is much bigger than we thought," Parker said, feeling a knot form in his throat. As they explored the cabin further, Parker found something even more revealing: an old leather-bound journal, covered in dust. He opened it carefully, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes. The words were fragmented, almost incoherent, but the central theme was clear: sacrifices. The entries described a series of macabre rituals, all performed with the goal of appeasing an entity the author referred to as the One Who Watches. Lewis read a passage aloud. "Only through blood will balance be restored. Only the chosen can see the light after the darkness." "This isn't just an altar, Lewis," Parker said, closing the journal. "This is a shrine to something I can't even begin to imagine." As they were about to leave the cabin to call for backup, the dog started barking again. It ran to the back of the room and began scratching at a part of the floor. "There's something under here," Parker said, kneeling to investigate. He found a small lever hidden beneath a dusty rug. With combined effort, he and Lewis pulled it, revealing a wooden hatch leading to a basement. The smell of decay grew even stronger as they descended the narrow staircase, their flashlights illuminating the damp stone walls. The space below was small but enough to house something that made them freeze in place: a collection of personal items carefully arranged on improvised shelves. "These belong to the victims," Lewis said, pointing at watches, jewelry, and even folded clothes. In the center of the basement was a table covered with a blood-stained cloth. Above it, a strange symbol was carved into the ceiling, like a mark left by someone, or something that used the space for dark purposes. As Parker and Lewis examined the objects, a sudden sound shattered the silence: the noise of footsteps coming from upstairs. They immediately drew their weapons, pointing them toward the staircase. "We're not alone," Parker whispered, his heart pounding. When they climbed back up, the cabin was empty. The dog that had guided them there had also vanished. All that remained was the oppressive weight of the mystery they had uncovered, and the unsettling feeling that something or someone was still watching. Parker and Lewis stepped cautiously back into the main cabin, hearts racing. Whatever, or whoever, had made the noise upstairs was gone. The dog that led them there was nowhere to be seen. Only the cabin's eerie silence lingered, an invisible presence watching their every move. "It can't just be the wind," Lewis said, gripping her weapon tightly. She scanned the room, her eyes wide and alert for any sign of movement. Parker also felt that something was wrong. The photos on the walls, the disturbing journal in the basement, the makeshift altar. Everything pointed to someone still being close, perhaps even watching. Back in the main room, Parker opened the journal once more with trembling hands. Something told him the answers were hidden there. He flipped through the pages quickly until he reached a section with recent dates. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a note. The handwriting was hurried, almost illegible, but one word stood out repeatedly: sacrifice. Lewis grabbed another flashlight and shone it on the text as she read aloud. "Their arrival has been foretold. The earth needs balance, and blood must be offered. The chosen one will know where to find the light." Chosen? What is he talking about? Lewis asked, confused. Before Parker could respond, he noticed something else tucked inside the journal, a folded piece of paper wedged between the pages. Carefully, he removed and unfolded it, revealing a map. In the center of the map, a spot was marked with the same symbol they had seen carved into the basement ceiling. "This place, it's close by," Parker murmured, pointing to the location. As they examined the map, Lewis noticed something unusual on the altar. One of the objects, a small figurine made of black stone, seemed to emit a faint, almost imperceptible glow under the flashlight. She picked it up hesitantly, feeling an intense cold radiating from the stone. The texture was rough, but there was something unsettling about the figurine's form, a humanoid figure with large hollow eyes, as if it were staring directly at whoever held it. "This doesn't seem human," Lewis said nervously. Parker leaned in for a closer look. "It's not just a figurine. Look at the details. It's like something ancient, very ancient." At the base of the figure, there were inscriptions that appeared to be in an unknown language. They quickly took photos, knowing they couldn't decipher the meaning there. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed again, this time closer. But now, it wasn't coming from upstairs, it was coming from the forest outside. The dog. Parker ran to the door, but what he saw made his heart race. The forest seemed darker than before, with a thick mist covering the ground. The dog was standing at the edge of the trail, staring at them, but something about it had changed. The animal seemed nervous, almost afraid, as if it were warning them not to approach. "He wants to take us somewhere else," Parker said, realizing the dog's mission wasn't over. Lewis hesitated. "What if it's a trap? We've seen too much to trust this." But Parker knew they had no other choice. Something about the dog's behavior seemed desperate. Following the animal once more, the agents entered the dense forest, now even more terrified by what they had found in the cabin. Each step on the trail felt heavier, as if the ground itself was becoming harder to traverse. Finally, they reached a small clearing, marked by stones arranged in circles. At the center, a massive symbol was drawn on the ground with what looked like dried blood. It was the same symbol they had seen in the basement. Lewis held her breath, trying to process what she was seeing. Whoever this is, they're not just kidnapping people. This is something much bigger. Parker slowly approached the circle. In the middle, something was buried, a thick wooden box sealed with rusty chains. "What is this?" Lewis asked as Parker cautiously used his knife to pry open the chains. When they finally managed to open the box, its contents left them in absolute shock. Human bones mixed with ancient artifacts, including scrolls covered in incomprehensible writing. But the most terrifying part came moments later. A distant scream echoed through the forest, something that sounded human but also not quite. "We need to get out of here now," Lewis said, a wave of panic overtaking her. Parker froze for a moment, staring at the dog, which now seemed different, darker, almost as if it too was part of the mystery. What happened next would forever mark the agents' lives. The discovery of the cabin and the circle in the forest triggered a larger investigation. But no satisfactory explanation was ever found for the bones, the artifacts, or the dog that had guided them. What was buried in that forest? Who was responsible? And more importantly, what was still lurking in the shadows? Back at the safety of the station, Parker and Lewis were far from feeling at ease. The cabin, the basement, the circle in the forest, and whatever was in that box were more than just pieces of an investigation. They felt like fragments of a puzzle they had no idea how to start solving. The dog that had guided them vanished without a trace, just like the unsettling sounds they had heard in the forest. The feeling that something, or someone, was still watching never left them. The evidence was sent for analysis. The journal, the photos, the artifacts found in the cabin, and even the rusty chains that had sealed the box. But the more the specialists tried to decipher the objects, the more questions arose. The human bones found in the box were identified as belonging to several missing persons over the past decades. But the most disturbing discovery was that some of the remains bore unusual marks, almost like inscriptions carved directly into the bones, symbols that no one could identify. The scrolls were written in an unknown language, but the analysis revealed something even more intriguing. The material used for writing was organic, with components dating back hundreds of years. "This doesn't make sense," Parker said, reading the report. "Whoever's behind this, they didn't just start now. This is much bigger." As the investigation progressed, the agents tried to locate the dog that had led them to the cabin. They used security cameras and asked local residents for information, but there was no sign of the animal anywhere. To Parker, that was the most unsettling part. How did it know where to take us? How did it disappear like that? Lewis, on the other hand, began questioning whether the dog was really what it seemed to be. What if it wasn't just a dog? Parker, what if it was part of this? The idea seemed absurd, but with each passing day, fewer answers emerged, and the mystery only deepened. The journal, map, and ancient artifacts led investigators to an even more disturbing discovery. They found records of similar disappearances in the region dating back over a century. All followed a similar pattern: people vanishing without explanation, trails leading to isolated forests, and occasional vague reports of strange symbols carved into trees or stones. It was as if what they had uncovered wasn't the work of a single individual but something larger, something that transcended generations. "This isn't just a case. It's a tradition," Parker said, clutching the journal tightly. "A tradition that should never have continued." Despite all efforts to unravel the mystery, the case was filed as inconclusive. There were no suspects, and those responsible for the remains were never found. The cabin was sealed off, but locals began reporting that something strange was still happening in the forest. Stories emerged of people hearing distant sounds, like footsteps or whispers, and even sightings of a dog wandering alone among the trees. Parker and Lewis, unable to forget what they had seen, continued to search for answers on their own. But the more they investigated, the more they seemed to get lost in the mystery. "Sometimes, I think it wasn't a coincidence," Parker said during a conversation with Lewis. "The dog, it chose us. But maybe not to solve this. Maybe to show us there are things we'll never understand." Even months after the investigation, the case was closed with no identified culprit. But for Parker and Lewis, the memory of that dog in that cabin remained a haunting reminder that the world still holds secrets beyond comprehension. "Sometimes, answers come from the most unexpected places," Parker said in an interview years later. "But some things should never be found." The story remains a mystery to this day. The dog that guided them disappeared as mysteriously as it appeared. What was it, after all? How did it know what was in that place? And, more importantly, how many secrets like this still remain hidden in the world?